In the summer of 1982, a young couple who had recently started dating decided to plan a weekend getaway. They were both teenagers, full of energy, and they absolutely loved the outdoors. Maine has some of the most beautiful, dense forests in the entire country, and so they figured that packing up a tent and some sleeping bags and heading deep into the woods would be the perfect way to spend a few days together. They picked a remote camping area, pitched their tent in a quiet clearing surrounded by massive pine trees, and spent the evening laughing, talking, and enjoying the stillness of nature. Eventually, the sun went down, the forest grew cold, and they zipped themselves inside their tent, snuggled into their sleeping bags, and drifted off to sleep. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the young girl woke up. She had that very uncomfortable feeling of needing to use the bathroom, and she lay there for a few minutes trying to ignore it, hoping she could just fall back asleep. But she could not. She realized she was going to have to get out of her warm sleeping bag, unzip the tent, and head out into the dark woods. She sat up quietly so she would not wake her boyfriend and began to reach for the zipper of the tent door. But right as her fingers touched the metal pull, she froze. She heard a sound. It was not very loud, but in the absolute silence of the Maine woods, it was incredibly distinct. It sounded like something was scratching or digging in the dirt right outside their tent. She stopped breathing, listening intently, trying to figure out what kind of animal would be making that noise. She figured it was probably just a small raccoon or maybe a squirrel looking for scraps of food they might have left behind. It was dark, but a little bit of moonlight was filtering through the trees, casting a soft glow over the clearing just outside. She decided to unzip the tent just a tiny fraction of an inch, just enough to peek through the gap and scare away whatever little animal was making the noise. She pulled the zipper down very slowly and looked through the small opening. What she saw made her heart completely stop. It was not a raccoon. It was not a squirrel. Sitting just 2 or 3 feet away from the entrance of her tent was a grown woman. The woman was squatting down on the ground with her back turned toward the tent. She was completely silent, but her hands were moving in a frantic, feverish motion. She was clawing and digging into the dirt with her bare fingers, throwing handfuls of soil to the side, as if she was desperately searching for something buried deep beneath the surface. The teenage girl was so startled and terrified by this bizarre sight that she literally lost her balance and fell backward into the tent, landing right on top of her boyfriend. He immediately bolted upright, completely confused and startled, and asked her what was going on. She scrambled to cover his mouth with her hand, whispering for him to be quiet. She pointed directly at the tiny unzipped opening in the tent door and told him he needed to look. The boy was thoroughly confused, but he could see the sheer terror in his girlfriend's eyes, so he knew she was not joking. He crept forward quietly, positioned his eye near the gap, and peered outside. Sure enough, there was the woman still squatting in the dirt, digging wildly. The boy recoiled in disbelief. He whispered to his girlfriend, asking what on earth was happening out there. He decided he needed to do something to get this person away from their camp. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, ignoring his girlfriend's whispered pleas for him to just stay still. He unzipped the tent door a bit further, aimed the flashlight directly at the woman's back, and clicked it on. A bright beam of white light illuminated her completely. The sudden light caught the woman's attention. She stopped digging, her hands hovering just above the soil. Then she stood up very slowly. She turned around to face the tent, looking directly into the bright beam of the flashlight. The young couple expected her to look startled or angry, or perhaps embarrassed for being caught lurking around their camp. But she did none of those things. Her face was completely blank. She had no expression whatsoever. She did not act aggressive, she did not look scared, and she did not say a word. She just stood there in the spotlight, staring directly at them with a cold, neutral gaze. For what felt like several minutes, no one moved. The boy kept the light trained on her, and the woman just stared back into the tent. Finally, without any explanation or warning, she turned around and calmly walked away, disappearing into the dark shadows of the forest. The young couple sat inside their tent for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting to make sure she was truly gone. Once they were reasonably certain they were safe, they unzipped the tent all the way and stepped outside. They shone their flashlights around the perimeter of their campsite, scanning the tree line, but there was no sign of the woman. They walked over to the spot where she had been squatting and shone their lights on the ground. There was a strange, shallow hole in the dirt, maybe 4 inches deep. There was absolutely no rhyme or reason as to why a grown woman would be digging a random hole in the middle of the night right next to a stranger's tent. The couple debated what they should do. They were deeply unsettled, but they were miles away from their car, and it was the middle of the night. They decided that packing up in the dark would be too dangerous and difficult, so they settled on a plan. They would stay the night, and first thing in the morning, they would pack up, hike back to the ranger station, and report the strange encounter to the park rangers. Feeling relatively confident that the woman was gone for good after being confronted, they climbed back into the tent, zipped it securely shut, got back into their sleeping bags, and tried to calm their racing hearts. But just as they were about to drift off to sleep, they heard a terrifying sound. Someone was running. and they were running directly toward their campsite. Before they could even process the sound, they realized the person had arrived. They unzipped the tent again and looked out. The woman had returned. But this time, she was not digging. She had walked over to their camping gear and supplies that they had left neatly stacked outside the tent, and she was actively rummaging through them. The way she was doing it was incredibly unsettling. The couple later described her behavior as almost monkey-like. She would grab an item, hold it up to her face to inspect it for a brief second, and then violently chuck it over her head behind her. Then she would reach down, grab another item, look at it, and throw it behind her. She was systematically tossing their belongings all over the clearing. The teenage boy, now feeling a mix of fear and sheer anger, stepped completely out of the tent. He shone his flashlight directly in her face and yelled at her to leave, but the woman did not even flinch. She did not look at him or acknowledge his presence. She just kept picking up their gear and throwing it over her shoulders. The boy took a step closer and raised his voice, screaming as forcefully as he could that she needed to get out of their camp right now. At that point, the woman finally paused. She stopped throwing their things, turned her head slowly, and looked at him. She had a look on her face of complete confusion, almost as if she was thinking, "Why are you here? What are you doing in my space?" She stood up, turned around, and once again walked away into the darkness. Now the young couple was in a state of total panic. This woman was clearly not deterred by being confronted, and she seemed entirely unpredictable. They spent the next 15 minutes standing outside their tent, shining their lights into the woods, making as much noise as possible, and shouting into the dark. They treated her like a wild animal, hoping that by making a lot of noise and showing aggression, they could scare her away for good. After a while, the woods fell silent again. They convinced themselves that their aggressive display must have worked. There was no way she would come back after they had screamed at her like that. Exhausted and cold, they climbed back into the tent, zipped it shut, and settled into their sleeping bags. But the moment the zipper clicked closed, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting right back into their camp. It was as if she had been standing just beyond the tree line, waiting in the shadows for the exact moment they went back inside. This time, she ran straight to the hole she had started earlier. She dropped to her knees and began digging into the dirt as fast as she possibly could, her hands moving in a desperate frenzy. The couple threw open the tent door, absolutely furious and terrified. They stepped out and began screaming at the top of their lungs, using every expletive they could think of, demanding that she get out. This intense shouting finally seemed to startle the woman. She stopped digging, looked up at them with a deeply wounded expression, as if she could not understand why they were being so mean to her, and then she bolted. She ran away, but the way she ran was not like a normal human. She moved in an animalistic, almost feral way, disappearing rapidly into the dense brush. By now, it was about 1:30 in the morning. The teenagers were completely shaken. They knew they could not go back to sleep. This woman was lurking nearby, and she clearly had an obsession with their campsite. They decided the only safe option was to stay awake. They turned on all their lanterns, held their flashlights, and sat outside their tent, resolved to stay on guard until the sun came up. By 3:30 in the morning, they had been sitting in the cold for 2 hours. The forest was dead silent, and there had been no sign of the woman. They were freezing, incredibly tired, and their eyes were heavy. They figured that after 2 hours of quiet, she must have finally given up and left the area. They decided to take a chance and go back inside the tent to get a couple of hours of sleep before sunrise. They crawled back into their sleeping bags and, thankfully, slept without any further interruptions. The next morning, the sun rose and the couple unzipped their tent. When they stepped outside, they were stunned. Their entire campsite was in complete disarray. All of their gear, food, and supplies had been flung in every direction across the clearing. But when they walked over to the spot where the woman had been digging, they gasped. The hole, which had been about 4 to 6 inches deep when they went to sleep, was now well over a foot deep. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The woman had not left at 1:30 in the morning. She had not left during the 2 hours they sat outside on guard. She had been standing in the pitch-black shadows of the forest, just feet away from them, silent and motionless, watching them for 2 hours. She had waited patiently for them to let their guard down and go back inside the tent. And the moment they zipped the door shut, she had crept back out, ransacked their site, and spent the rest of the night digging her hole. But the absolute strangest part of the entire ordeal was that when they gathered up their scattered belongings, they realized that absolutely nothing was missing. There were several expensive pieces of camping equipment lying out in the open that she easily could have stolen, but she did not take a single thing. She had only wanted to throw their items around and dig in the dirt. The couple packed up their camp as fast as they could and hiked back to the ranger station. They found a park ranger and told him the entire story, detailing the woman's bizarre behavior and her strange obsession with digging. The ranger listened to them with a look of complete bewilderment. He told them he had never heard of anything like that happening in the park and had no idea what to make of it. Deeply unsettled and unwilling to spend another moment in those woods, The young couple got into their car and left Maine that very day. To this day, they have no idea who that woman was or what she was searching for in the dirt. While some mysteries leave us with a sense of unease, there is nothing quite as captivating as a story with a deep historical puzzle, a narrative that draws you in and leaves you questioning what is truly possible. I am a complete addict when it comes to searching for real-life stories with incredible twists, and in my opinion, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers of Alien Moor. To give you the basic overview, a relief crew was sent out to a remote lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They were there to bring fresh supplies, relieve the men who had been stationed there, and make sure everything was running smoothly. But when they arrived on the island, they found a scene of complete desertion. The 3 lighthouse keepers were gone. The island and the lighthouse were in a state of disarray, and when they uncovered the logbook left behind by the keepers, they found entries that simply did not make sense. When they compared those entries to the reports from people on the mainland, the mystery only deepened, creating a baffling puzzle that has never been solved. Our story takes place off the rugged coast of northwestern Scotland, where a cluster of 7 small, uninhabited islands known as the Flannan Isles rises out of the Atlantic Ocean. The largest of these islands is called Alien Moor, and perched atop its steep cliffs is a solitary lighthouse. Alien Moor has a long and incredibly creepy history. For centuries, the island had a reputation for being haunted or surrounded by some kind of paranormal energy. The only regular visitors to the island were sheep herders who would occasionally bring their flocks to graze on the fertile grass. Many of these herders reported hearing strange, disembodied voices screaming in the wind and felt a constant, heavy sensation of being watched. Even travelers who knew nothing of the island's folklore reported feeling an immediate sense of dread the moment they set foot on Alien Moor. The island was also home to the ancient ruin of a chapel dedicated to St. Flannan. Over the years, visitors to this chapel reported an overwhelming, almost magnetic pull to pray. This feeling was so intense that a bizarre ritual developed among those who visited. It became customary that as soon as you arrived at the chapel, you would drop to your knees and crawl completely around the building before entering to pray. It was a place steeped in superstition and strange energy. In December of 1900, a steamship was navigating the dark waters near the Flannan Isles. As the crew looked toward Alien Moor, they noticed something highly unusual. The great light atop the lighthouse was completely dark. The lighthouse was not operating. When the ship finally docked at a port on the mainland 3 days later, the crew reported the outage to the authorities, explaining that the light on Alien Moor was out and someone needed to check on the station. As it happened, a relief voyage was already scheduled to head out to the island to replace the keepers and deliver fresh supplies. Captain James Harvey gathered his crew aboard the steamship Hesperus, along with Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper who was set to take over the shift. They set sail for Alien Moor, unaware of the mystery that awaited them. As the Hesperus approached the towering cliffs of Alien Moor, the crew looked up at the massive concrete staircase that climbed from the landing dock all the way up to the lighthouse. Under normal circumstances, the keepers on duty would have spotted the ship's approach from their high vantage point. It was strict protocol for the keepers to walk down the steps to the dock, ready to help secure the vessel and assist with the unloading of supplies. But as the ship drew closer, the dock was completely empty. No one was standing on the landing, and no one was walking down the steep steps. Even more concerning, there were no signs that any preparations had been made to receive the ship. The landing gear was not set up, and the dock was in a state of neglect. A heavy silence hung over the island. Joseph Moore later recalled that as he looked at the empty cliffs, a sudden, deep sense of dread washed over him. He felt an overwhelming premonition that something terrible had happened. Captain Harvey blew the ship's steam whistle and fired a warning flare to get the keeper's attention, but there was no response. The island remained dead silent. The captain turned to Joseph Moore and told him he needed to go ashore alone to perform a quick inspection of the station and find out why the men were not responding. Moore stepped onto the dock and began the long, steep climb up the stone steps. The climb was physically exhausting, but the mental strain was even worse. As he neared the top of the cliff, he noticed something bizarre. The heavy steel railings that ran along the staircase had been violently bent and twisted out of shape. They looked as if they had been made of cheap tinfoil and folded in half by some unimaginable force. When he reached the top of the cliff, he saw another strange sight. A massive stone boulder, which had sat firmly in the same spot for decades, had been moved several feet. There was a clear, fresh trail of torn grass and dirt showing where the boulder had rolled across the ground. Moore was stunned. He assumed that a storm of historic proportions must have battered the island, causing this incredible physical damage. He figured the keepers must have been so overwhelmed by the storm that they were unable to keep the light lit. He hurried over to the lighthouse compound and walked up to the entrance. The door was closed but unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into the quiet entrance hall. He immediately called out the names of the 3 keepers on duty: Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. His voice echoed through the empty stone corridors, but no one answered. As he stood in the hallway, he looked at the wooden coat pegs on the wall. Hanging on one of the pegs was a heavy oilskin jacket. In the harsh, freezing winters of the North Atlantic, no experienced lighthouse keeper would ever step outside onto the cliffs without their protective oilskin gear. The fact that one of the jackets had been left behind suggested that whoever owned it had left the building in an extreme hurry or had not intended to go outside at all. Moore walked into the kitchen and found a scene that looked as if it had been frozen in time. On the table sat plates of food, including pieces of meat and a jar of pickles that had been left open. A couple of the wooden chairs had been knocked over onto the floor, as if the men had jumped up suddenly, knocking their chairs backward in their haste to leave. He walked over to the mechanical wall clock and realized it had completely stopped ticking. He moved through the rest of the living quarters and checked the bedrooms. The beds were unmade, which was highly unusual for disciplined keepers who took great pride in maintaining the order of the station. Everything pointed to a sudden, chaotic event that had forced the men to abandon their post in an instant. Moore ran back down the steps to the dock and reported his findings to Captain Harvey. The captain and his crew climbed the steps to see the scene for themselves. Realizing that a tragedy had occurred, Captain Harvey sent a telegram back to the mainland authorities. He wrote that a dreadful accident had taken place and that the 3 keepers had completely vanished from the island. He suggested that the men must have been blown over the cliffs by the wind or swept into the ocean while trying to secure their equipment during a storm. Over the next few days, Joseph Moore and the investigators began a thorough search of the island, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened to the missing men. They eventually located the official logbook kept by the keepers. The early entries in the logbook were standard, routine notes about the weather, passing ships, and daily chores. But the entries starting on December 12th grew incredibly strange. Thomas Marshall, the keeper who wrote the entry, noted that severe, violent winds were battering the island. He wrote that he had been a keeper for decades, but he had never seen a storm of such terrifying intensity. He expressed deep concern over whether the sturdy stone lighthouse would even be able to withstand the force of the wind, but then the entry took an emotional turn. Marshall wrote that James Ducat, who was normally a quiet and composed man, was extremely quiet and seemed deeply unsettled. He then wrote that Donald MacArthur, a tough, hardened, salty veteran of the sea who was famous for his bravery, was sitting in the corner crying. It seemed impossible that a man who had weathered dozens of ocean storms would be brought to tears by wind. The entries on December 13th and 14th continued to describe the relentless storm. Marshall wrote that all 3 men were praying constantly, terrified that they were going to be swept into the sea. The final entry was dated December 15th. It read simply, "Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all." The head of the official investigation, Robert Muirhead, concluded that after making that final entry on December 15th, the 3 men must have gone down to the landing dock to secure some loose equipment that had been damaged by the storm. While they were working near the water, a massive rogue wave must have crashed over the landing, sweeping all 3 of them into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. It was a tragic but logical explanation. However, when news of the tragedy reached the Scottish mainland, the people living along the coast were deeply confused by the official report. Ely and Moore is close enough to the mainland that the island is clearly visible on a clear day. The coastal residents told investigators that during the exact dates mentioned in the logbook, December 12th through December 15th, there was absolutely no storm in the area. In fact, they reported that the weather had been incredibly calm, and the visibility was so perfect that they could see details of Ely and Moore that were usually hidden by haze. There had been no violent winds, no terrifying storm, and no driving rain. This revelation shattered the logic of the logbook. If there was no storm, why did the keepers write that they were terrified for their lives? Why did they claim the wind was the worst they had ever seen? Why was a hardened sea veteran crying in the corner, and why were they all praying for salvation? Furthermore, if there was no storm, how did the heavy steel railings on the staircase get bent and twisted like tinfoil, and how did a massive boulder get dragged across the grass? Over the years, many theories have been proposed to explain the disappearance of the Ely and Moore keepers. Some suggested that one of the men went mad, murdered the other 2, and then threw himself into the ocean. Others pointed to the island's haunted reputation, suggesting that some supernatural force had claimed the men. Subsequent keepers who were stationed at the lighthouse reported hearing disembodied voices whispering the names of the missing men in the wind, only adding to the island's eerie mystique. To this day, the true fate of the 3 keepers remains one of the most baffling and chilling mysteries in maritime history. Just as the sea holds secrets that defy explanation, the vast forests of our world have also been the backdrop for events that challenge our understanding of reality. One of the most famous and highly scrutinized accounts of an extraordinary event took place in the autumn of 1975, involving a young man named Travis Walton. In 1975, Travis Walton was a 22-year-old living in the small, quiet town of Snowflake, Arizona. Travis had a bit of a reputation as a free spirit and a daredevil. He rode a loud Harley-Davidson motorcycle, participated in wild bull riding, and was an amateur boxer. His friends knew him as a guy who never backed down from a challenge. There was a legendary story in town about a time Travis was in a car with his buddies and a massive bear walked out of the woods, blocking the road. Instead of staying safely inside the vehicle, Travis jumped out of the car and ran directly toward the bear, screaming and waving his arms until the startled animal turned and bolted up into the hills. He was a guy who acted on pure adrenaline and curiosity. Travis worked as a logger, clearing timber in the rugged mountains of Arizona. He was part of a tight-knit crew of 7 men, led by a crew boss named Mike Rogers. The job of a logger is incredibly demanding and physically dangerous. It requires sharp focus, physical strength, and a level-headed attitude. The men in Mike's crew were pragmatic, blue-collar workers who spent their days operating heavy chainsaws, axes, and hauling massive logs. They were not the kind of people given to wild fantasies or active imaginations. On November 5, 1975, Mike Rogers secured a contract to thin out a massive 1,200-acre section of the Sitgreaves National Forest. The job was behind schedule, and Mike knew his crew would have to work incredibly hard to catch up. They piled into Mike's old pickup truck early in the morning and spent a grueling, exhausting day in the forest, working well past sunset. By the time they finally wrapped up for the evening, the forest was pitch black, and the men were completely spent. They all piled back into the cab of the truck, cramped and tired, and Mike began driving down a narrow, bumpy dirt access road toward the highway. The men were quiet, looking forward to getting home, taking hot showers, and getting some rest. As the truck bounced along the dark road, one of the men noticed a strange, bright glow flickering through the thick trees off to the right side of the road. Initially, the men did not think much of it. Someone suggested it was probably just the reflection of the full moon shining through the pine needles. But another crew member looked out the left side of the truck and pointed out that the moon was actually visible on the opposite side of the sky. Then, someone suggested it might be a forest fire starting up in the brush. Mike Rogers looked toward the glow but noted there was no smell of smoke and no haze rising into the night air. Travis Walton, true to his adventurous nature, grew incredibly excited. He urged Mike to drive closer and see what was causing the strange light. The rest of the crew was hesitant, feeling a sudden sense of unease, but they figured there was no harm in taking a quick look before heading home. Mike turned the truck down a rougher, lesser-used logging trail that led toward the source of the glow. As the truck cleared a thick patch of trees and entered a wide, open clearing, the entire crew gasped in disbelief. Hovering silently in the center of the clearing, about 15 to 20 feet above the ground, was a massive, metallic, disc-shaped craft. It was about 15 feet high and 30 feet wide, glowing with a brilliant golden light that illuminated the entire clearing. The craft was perfectly still, suspended in midair as if completely defying the laws of gravity. The men sat frozen in the cab of the truck, staring through the windshield at the incredible object. One of the loggers, who had experience in construction, later noted that he was struck by the flawless, seamless engineering of the craft's underside, which featured intricate panels of light. Before anyone could say a word, Travis Walton did something incredibly reckless. Driven by a surge of pure curiosity and adrenaline, he threw open the passenger door of the truck and stepped out into the cold night air. He began walking at a brisk pace directly toward the hovering craft. Inside the truck, the rest of the crew instantly panicked. They began screaming at Travis to get back in the truck, warning him that the object could be highly dangerous or could fall on him. But Travis was completely mesmerized. He walked until he was standing almost directly underneath the glowing disc, looking up at its smooth, metallic surface. Suddenly, the silent craft began to make a loud, vibrating, mechanical sound. It started to spin slowly, and the golden light emanating from its underside grew incredibly intense. Travis realized he had made a terrible mistake. He decided to turn around and run back to the safety of the truck, but before he could take a single step, a brilliant, solid beam of blue-green light erupted from the center of the craft and struck Travis squarely in the chest. The rest of the crew watched in horror through the truck windows as Travis was violently lifted off his feet, his body rigid and surrounded by a glowing halo of energy. He was flung backward through the air, landing heavily on the ground some 20 feet away, where he lay completely still, terrified and convinced that Travis had just been killed by some kind of weapon. Mike Rogers slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, and they sped away down the dirt road, leaving Travis behind in the clearing. The men in the cab were hysterical, crying and screaming in absolute terror, unable to process the impossible event they had just witnessed. After driving about a mile down the road, Mike Rogers came to a stop. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt. He looked at his crew and told them they could not just abandon their friend, whether he was dead or alive. He told them he was going back to the clearing, and if they were too scared, they could get out and wait in the dark. No one wanted to be left alone in the forest after what they had just seen, so they agreed to go back together. Mike turned the truck around and drove slowly back to the clearing. When they arrived, the clearing was completely dark. The glowing craft was gone and the sky was empty. They got out of the truck with their flashlights, calling out Travis's name, but there was no response, there was no body, no blood, and no sign that Travis had ever been there. He had completely vanished. Realizing they needed help, they drove to a nearby town and found a payphone. Ken Peterson, the most composed member of the crew, called the local sheriff's department. He told the dispatcher that a member of their crew was missing in the forest and they needed deputies to come out immediately. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and his deputy, Ken Copeland, met the crew at a nearby rest stop. The men looked visibly distraught, pale, and shaken. When Mike Rogers and the crew tried to explain what had happened, they hesitated to mention the UFO, knowing how crazy it would sound. But eventually, the truth came out. They told the sheriff that a strange glowing craft had zapped Travis with a beam of light and he had disappeared. The sheriffs were deeply skeptical. They immediately suspected that the loggers were spinning a wild, fantastical tale to cover up a violent crime. They figured the men had gotten into a fight in the woods, accidentally killed Travis, hid his body, and invented the UFO story to escape prosecution. A massive search effort was launched the following morning. Dozens of volunteers, deputies, and search dogs scoured the area of the forest where the incident had occurred, but they found absolutely no trace of Travis Walton. During the search, Mike Rogers noticed 3 men wearing red jackets walking through the woods. They were carrying electronic devices that looked like advanced metal detectors, scanning the ground and the brush. Mike approached them, assuming they were specialized investigators. When he asked what they were doing, they told him they were testing the area for radiation. Mike realized that he and his crew had been close to the craft when it discharged the beam of light, and their gear might have been exposed. He asked the men in red to scan the crew's hard hats, which had been left in the back of the truck during the encounter. The men swept their detectors over one of the helmets, and the needle on the device instantly pegged to the maximum level, indicating a highly unusual concentration of radiation. The men in red looked at each other, whispered quietly, and then packed up their equipment and walked away without explaining what the reading meant. When Mike asked the sheriff who those men were, the sheriff was confused, stating that he had not authorized any radiation teams to be on the site. The identity of the men in red remains a mystery to this day. As the days passed with no sign of Travis, the pressure on the crew intensified. The small town of Snowflake turned on them, believing they were murderers. The media descended on the town, turning the disappearance into a massive sensational story. Frustrated and determined to break the crew's story, Sheriff Gillespie demanded that the 6 loggers submit to a polygraph examination. The state brought in a highly respected, experienced polygraph examiner to test the men. One by one, the loggers were questioned for hours about whether they had harmed Travis, whether they knew where his body was, and whether they had fabricated the UFO story. When the results came in, the examiner was stunned. 5 of the loggers passed the test with flying colors, showing absolute truthfulness when describing the glowing craft and the beam of light. The 6th logger's test was deemed inconclusive, but not deceptive. The examiner told the sheriff that it was statistically impossible for 5 men to successfully fake a polygraph test regarding a fabricated murder cover-up. They were telling the truth as they believed it. Then, 5 days after his disappearance, the telephone rang at Travis Walton's brother's house. It was Travis. He was calling from a payphone at a gas station on the outskirts of Snowflake. His voice was incredibly weak, trembling, and he sounded completely disoriented. He kept repeating, "They brought me back, please come get me." His brother rushed to the location and found Travis collapsed in the phone booth. He was pale, severely dehydrated, malnourished, and in a state of profound shock. He looked as if he had been through an incredible physical ordeal. His brother immediately drove him to a hospital in Phoenix to get medical attention and to protect him from the media circus that had taken over Snowflake. A medical examination revealed that Travis had lost a significant amount of weight, was suffering from acute dehydration, but had no major physical injuries except for a small, distinct puncture mark in the crease of his right elbow. A toxicology screen showed no drugs or alcohol in his system. Initially, Travis had absolutely no memory of the 5 days he had been missing. He believed that only a few hours had passed since he stepped out of Mike's truck to look at the craft. He was shocked when his brother informed him that he had been gone for 5 full days. Over the following weeks, as Travis recovered in a quiet, private location, his memory began to return in terrifying flashes. He began to piece together what had happened to him after the beam of light struck him in the clearing. He recalled waking up in a low-ceiling room filled with a warm, damp orange light. He felt a heavy sensation in his chest and had difficulty breathing. He looked up and saw what he assumed were medical professionals standing over him, wearing white gowns and masks. He figured his crew had rescued him from the forest and brought him to a hospital. But as his vision cleared, he realized the figures standing over him were not human. They were short, about 4 feet tall, with pale, hairless, grayish skin. Their heads were oversized and domed, with tiny noses, no ears, and massive, dark, glassy eyes that had no pupils. They were staring down at him with an eerie, emotionless intensity. Terrified, Travis experienced a massive surge of adrenaline. He knocked a strange, rectangular metallic object off his chest, scrambled off the table, and grabbed a long, thin, cylindrical tool from a nearby shelf, waving it wildly at the creatures to keep them away. The small gray figures did not react with anger or fear. They simply turned around in unison and walked out of the room, leaving Travis alone. Travis stumbled out of the room and found himself in a curved metallic hallway. He walked down the corridor until he entered a circular room with a single, high-backed chair in the center. The walls of the room suddenly projected a highly detailed map of the stars, making him feel as though he was floating in deep space. While he was inspecting the controls on the chair, a door opened, and a tall figure wearing a bright blue uniform and a glossy helmet entered the room. Travis ran to him, pleading for help, assuming this was a human military pilot. The figure did not speak, but took Travis by the arm and led him down a series of corridors and out of the craft. They entered a massive, cavernous hangar bay where several other disc-shaped crafts were parked. The air was cool and smelled faintly of sulfur. The silent guide led Travis into another room where three other human-looking figures, two men and a woman, were waiting. They had a strange, distant look in their eyes and did not speak. They gently forced Travis onto a table, placed a clear mask over his face, and he instantly blacked out. The next thing he remembered was waking up on the cold asphalt of the highway outside Snowflake, watching a brilliant light streak up into the night sky and disappear into the stars. The Travis Walton case remains one of the most thoroughly documented and investigated accounts of a close encounter in history. Despite decades of intense skepticism, debunking attempts, and personal hardships, all 7 men involved have consistently maintained their accounts of what happened in the Sitgreaves National Forest on that cold November night in 1975. Just as some accounts challenge our view of the skies, other events deep within our country's vast wilderness areas remind us that there are still corners of the earth where things happen that defy easy explanation. In the summer of 2004, a team of wildland firefighters was dispatched deep into a rugged forest in central Idaho to contain a newly reported wilderness fire. The terrain was incredibly steep, covered in dense underbrush and ancient timber. As the crew set up their base camp, it became clear that the fire was moving much faster than initial reports had indicated, fueled by dry winds and high temperatures. Mike, the assistant superintendent of the crew and the second in command, decided he needed to scout ahead to find a safe route for his men and to see if they needed to establish a wider fire line. He hopped onto a rugged, all-terrain utility vehicle and took off down a long-abandoned, overgrown logging trail that cut deep into the wilderness. The trail was choked with weeds and fallen branches, indicating that no vehicle or human had passed through the area in decades. Mike had driven about a half-mile down the trail when he noticed a sudden movement in the brush off to his right. He slowed the vehicle down and watched as a large bobcat bounded out of the forest. The bobcat was running perpendicular to the trail, on a direct path to cross about 100 feet in front of him. Mike brought the vehicle to a complete stop, expecting the elusive animal to notice him, get spooked, and bolt back into the safety of the thick timber. Bobcats are notoriously shy, nocturnal creatures that do everything they can to avoid human contact, but instead of running, the bobcat leaped into the exact center of the dirt trail, spun around, and faced Mike. It lowered its head, arched its back, and assumed an incredibly aggressive territorial stance. Mike was stunned. The animal's behavior was completely unnatural. For about 10 seconds, the man and the wild cat stared at each other in complete silence. Then the bobcat opened its mouth wide and let out a sound. It did not hiss, growl, or screech like a wild cat. Instead, it emitted a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that sounded exactly like a human being in a state of absolute terror. The sound was incredibly loud, echoing off the surrounding trees, and it sent a chill straight down Mike's spine. It was a deeply wrong, unnatural sound to come from a bobcat. Before Mike could even process what he was hearing, the bobcat suddenly stopped screaming. It turned, bolted to a massive pine tree on the edge of the trail, scrambled up the rough bark with incredible speed, and perched itself on a thick branch that hung directly over the center of the path. Mike sat on his vehicle, looking up at the bobcat. To continue scouting the trail, he was going to have to drive directly underneath the aggressive, screaming animal. He debated turning back, but he knew his crew was counting on him to scout the fire line. He convinced himself that the cat was probably just terrified and cornered, and as long as he moved quickly, it would not attack. He gripped the handlebars, revved the engine, and accelerated down the path, driving directly under the overhanging branch. The bobcat did not jump, but as Mike looked back over his shoulder, he saw the animal had turned around on the branch and was staring down at him with a cold, intense glare. Mike continued down the trail for another half-mile, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. As he rounded a sharp bend in the path, he gasped. Tucked away in a small clearing in the dense woods was a small, rustic wooden cabin. Mike was deeply confused. He was operating on federal wilderness land, where private structures were strictly prohibited. The cabin looked incredibly old, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a dark gray. Mike realized that with the forest fire rapidly approaching the area, he had an obligation to check the cabin and make sure no one was inside. He parked his vehicle and walked toward the clearing. As he drew closer, he saw that all the windows had been heavily boarded up with thick, weathered wooden slats, making it look completely abandoned, but when he reached the front door, he noticed a strange detail. The door was fully intact, but the metal doorknob had been completely removed. In place of the doorknob, a thick, heavy, silver chain link had been threaded through the empty hole in the door and wrapped tightly around a stout wooden post that had been driven into the ground right outside. It was a crude, makeshift lock, and the metal of the chain was bright, shiny, and brand new, completely free of rust or tarnish. This meant that someone had been to this remote, illegal cabin very recently. Mike leaned down and peered through the empty doorknob hole into the dark interior of the cabin. The space was dim, but as he clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam through the opening, his stomach dropped. The cabin was fully furnished with old wooden tables, chairs, and cabinets. But every single piece of furniture inside the room had been placed completely upside down. The tables were resting on their tops with their legs sticking straight up in the air, and the chairs were balanced precariously on their backrests. The scene was incredibly bizarre and deeply creepy. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of being watched washed over Mike. He backed away from the door, turned around, and began walking quickly back to his vehicle. With every step, the urge to run grew stronger. He began to jog, then sprinted the last few yards, jumped onto the seat, threw the vehicle into reverse, and tore back up the logging trail toward his crew. As he neared the spot where he had encountered the bobcat, he slowed down, his eyes scanning the overhanging branches. But the bobcat was no longer in the tree. Instead, standing in the exact center of the dirt trail, right underneath the overhanging branch, was a middle-aged Native American woman. She was wearing a tattered, dirty white nightgown. Her feet were completely bare, and her hair was wild and unkempt. She was standing perfectly still, staring down the path in his direction, as if she had been waiting for him to return. Mike slammed on the brakes, stopping about 100 feet away. His heart was hammering in his chest. Before he could say a word or ask if she needed help, the woman opened her mouth and let out a scream. It was the exact same high-pitched, blood-curdling human scream that had come from the mouth of the bobcat just 20 minutes earlier. The sound was identical in pitch, volume, and tone. As she screamed, she suddenly turned, ran to the exact same pine tree, and began climbing the trunk with impossible, fluid speed, using her bare hands and feet to scramble up the bark like an animal. She pulled herself onto the overhanging branch, crouched down on all fours, and stared down at Mike with a wild, feral expression. Terrified and unwilling to spend another second in that clearing, Mike gunned the engine. He sped down the trail, ducking his head as he roared directly underneath the perched woman. As he looked back, he saw her sitting on the branch, her head turned completely in his direction. Watching him disappear into the forest, Mike made it back to his crew, pale and visibly trembling. He told his men what he had seen, but because they had to focus on containing the rapidly spreading fire, they were unable to investigate the cabin or search for the woman. A few days later, after the fire had been successfully contained and the crew was resting in a nearby mountain town, Mike struck up a conversation with an elderly local bartender. He asked the man if he knew of any old cabins located in that specific section of the forest. The bartender smiled and shook his head. He told Mike that when he was a kid, there were local rumors about an eccentric woman who lived in an old illegal cabin deep in those woods. The locals whispered that she was a witch, and she kept a large, wild bobcat as a pet, training it to stay near her property. The old-timers always warned the local kids to stay far away from that section of the forest, claiming that some things in the deep woods are best left undisturbed. Just as the wilderness can harbor secrets that defy explanation, sometimes the most unsettling and inexplicable events can follow a person right into the comfort of their own home. In 2002, Bill Vail was living a highly structured, rational life. Bill was a man of science and concrete facts. He had spent 15 years working as a highly accomplished robotics engineer for NASA and had also served as a pilot. He was a man who viewed the world through the lens of mathematics, physics, and empirical evidence. His family and friends often joked that Bill completely lacked an imagination, as he had absolutely no interest in creative fiction, superstition, or anything that could not be proven in a laboratory. But in 2002, Bill's life was turned upside down when he and his wife decided to separate. The sudden end of his marriage triggered a deep personal crisis. For the first time in his life, his career at NASA did not feel like enough to sustain him. He felt incredibly lonely, disconnected, and decided he needed a fresh start. He packed up his belongings and moved to Arlington, Texas, to be closer to his younger brother, Bob. To keep himself busy and establish a routine, Bill took a job working at his brother's water purification company. His role involved driving to customers' homes, demonstrating how the advanced filtration systems worked, and explaining the technical aspects of water safety. While the work was far less complex than designing robotics for space exploration, Bill enjoyed the simplicity and the opportunity to spend time with his brother. One Saturday afternoon, a last-minute service call came into the office. None of the senior technicians wanted to take a weekend shift, so Bill, wanting to make a good impression on his new coworkers, volunteered to handle the call. The company dispatcher gave Bill the address of a large brick home in a quiet Arlington suburb. She warned him that the customer had been incredibly adamant about one specific detail. The technician had to arrive at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, not a minute earlier, and not a minute later. Bill looked at the clock. It was currently 3 o'clock. He figured he would grab some lunch, drive over to the neighborhood, and wait in his car until the appointed time. At 4:59, Bill parked his vehicle, grabbed his demonstration kit, and walked up the concrete path toward the front door of the brick house. As he approached the porch, he noticed that the heavy wooden front door was slightly ajar. Resting open by about an inch, as he stepped onto the porch, he heard a sound coming from inside the house. It was the sound of a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. Bill hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. He could hear her voice clearly through the gap. She was shouting, "Get out of here! Leave this place!" over and over again. Bill knocked loudly on the door, but the screaming inside continued unabated. Concerned that a domestic dispute or a medical emergency was taking place, Bill pushed the door open and stepped into the entryway. He took a few steps down the quiet hallway and peered into a large room off to the right. In the center of the room, 3 grown men were kneeling on the carpet in a tight circle, their heads bowed and their hands clasped. Walking slowly around them in a circle was a middle-aged woman. She was holding a large, leather-bound book in her hands, and she was chanting rapidly in a strange, guttural language that Bill had never heard before. It sounded like complete gibberish, but every few seconds she would pause, touch the head of one of the men, and scream, "Get out of here! Leave these people!" Bill realized he had walked into some kind of intense religious ceremony or exorcism. Feeling incredibly awkward and violating their privacy, he decided to quiet step backward and leave the house. But before he could turn around, the chanting woman suddenly stopped. She snapped her head in his direction, looked directly into Bill's eyes, and pointed her finger straight at him. She did not break eye contact, and her face contorted into an expression of pure, intense hatred. A sudden, freezing wave of dread washed over Bill, and he felt an immediate physical sensation that this woman wanted to do him severe harm. Without saying a word, Bill spun around, ran out of the house, jogged to his car, and drove away. He immediately called his company's dispatcher and told her that the residents at that address were completely unstable, and he refused to return to the property under any circumstances. As a man of science, Bill did his best to rationalize the event, chalking it up to religious fanaticism, and decided to put the strange encounter out of his mind. He returned to his empty house, made a microwave dinner, sat in his favorite living room chair, and turned on the television to relax. Bill lived completely alone and did not own any pets. As he was watching the screen, a sudden movement out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. It looked like a small, dark shadow darting across the floor of the adjacent dining room. Bill paused, looking over at the empty room. He figured a small rodent, a mouse, or perhaps a bird had managed to slip down his chimney or through a gap in the window screen. He felt a brief wave of annoyance, realizing he would have to deal with an unwanted pest. He stood up, turned on all the lights in the house, and spent an hour searching the corners, under the furniture, and in the closets, but he found absolutely no sign of an animal. He shrugged, turned the lights back off, and went back to watching television. Later that night, Bill fell asleep in his large, 4-poster wooden bed. In the early hours of the morning, he was suddenly jolted awake by a highly unusual sensation. He felt a small, distinct weight running across the top of his blanket, moving directly over his feet. Instinctively, Bill pulled his legs up to his chest, his heart racing. He lay in the dark, listening for the sound of scratching or scurrying on the floorboards, but the room was dead silent. He flipped on the bedside lamp, grabbed a flashlight, and performed a thorough search of his bedroom, looking under the bed and in the closet. Once again, there was nothing there. Bill sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his eyes. He began to question whether his scientific, pragmatic mind was playing tricks on him. He reasoned that the stress of his recent divorce and the unsettling encounter at the brick house earlier that day had manifested as a vivid dream, causing him to imagine the sensation on his feet. He turned off the lamp and went back to sleep, but a short time later, Bill woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking the cause. His massive, heavy wooden bed was violently shaking from side to side. The movement was so intense that Bill was nearly thrown from the mattress. He scrambled out of bed and stood on the floor, expecting to feel the entire house rocking from a major earthquake. But as soon as his feet touched the hardwood floor, the shaking stopped. The house was completely still, and the items on his dresser were undisturbed. Bill walked to the window and looked outside. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights were on, and there was no sign of panic or damage. Bill, determined to find a rational explanation, sat down at his computer and began searching geological databases for any reports of seismic activity or earthquakes in the Arlington area. There were none. He then researched whether a sonic boom from the nearby Joint Reserve military base or a mechanical failure at a local oil drilling site could have caused the localized vibration. He was in the middle of reading an article when his internet connection suddenly went completely dead. Frustrated, Bill called his service provider's customer support line. After navigating an automated menu, a friendly representative with a distinct accent answered the call. Bill explained that his connection had dropped, and the representative told him she would run a diagnostic test on his line. Asking him to hold for a brief moment, Bill sat with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the soft elevator music playing on the line. Suddenly, the music cut out, replaced by a loud, harsh layer of static. Through the static, a deep, raspy, guttural voice began to speak. The voice was chanting rapidly in the exact same guttural, nonsensical tongue that the woman at the brick house had been using during her ceremony. The tone of the voice was incredibly angry and threatening, and it seemed to be directed specifically at Bill, deeply unsettled. Bill slammed the receiver down, terminating the call. A few seconds later, his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the same customer support representative calling him back. She apologized for the disconnection, but before she could return to her script, Bill stopped her. He asked her if she had heard the terrifying voice on the line before the call dropped. The representative paused, her tone suddenly becoming very quiet and serious. She admitted that she had heard the voice, and it had deeply frightened her. She explained to Bill that their corporate phone system was highly secure and encrypted, making it technically impossible for a third party to hijack the line or speak over the connection. She added that she had been trying to scream over the voice to tell Bill she was still there, but her microphone had been completely deactivated by the interference. She had no technical explanation for what had just occurred. Bill thanked her, hung up the phone, and realized his internet was back online. He looked at the clock. It was 3:00 in the morning. He decided he was too exhausted to continue his research and climbed back into bed, leaving the bedroom light turned on. As he lay under the covers, trying to calm his thoughts, he heard a soft, distinct rustling sound emanating from directly underneath his bed. The rational side of his brain screamed at him that it was just his imagination, but the fear was starting to take over. Like a terrified child, Bill pulled his heavy blanket completely over his head, curling his knees up to his chest. His blanket was a light, woven material, and with the bedroom light still turned on, a soft glow illuminated the small, enclosed space under the covers. Bill stared down toward the foot of his bed, his breathing shallow. As he watched, he saw a pale, thin hand slowly creep up from the edge of the mattress, sliding underneath the blanket. The hand reached out, its fingers twitching, moving directly toward Bill's bare foot. Bill screamed, kicked his legs violently, and threw himself out of the bed, landing heavily on the floor. He scrambled to his feet, backed against the wall, and stared at the empty bed. He summoned the courage to look underneath the frame, but there was nothing there. Bill did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in his downstairs living room with every light in the house turned on, drinking coffee and waiting for the sun to rise. The next day, Bill went to work as usual. He was exhausted, but he was determined not to let these bizarre occurrences derail his rational life. He told no one about what had happened, fearing they would think the former NASA engineer was suffering a mental breakdown. But when evening arrived and he returned to his empty house, the anxiety returned. He turned on every light in the home, made his dinner, and sat in his living room chair. As he raised a forkful of food to his mouth, a heavy glass bottle suddenly flew through the air, zinging directly past his head. It smashed violently against the wall behind him, showering the floor with shattered glass. Immediately, every single light in the house went completely dark. In a panic, Bill felt his way to a hallway closet where he kept a heavy flashlight. He threw the door open and reached inside. Right as his fingers touched the flashlight, a loud, violent slamming sound erupted from the top shelf of the closet as if a massive invisible hand had lifted a heavy storage box and smashed it back down onto the wood. Bill grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and scanned the closet, but everything was in its proper place. The lights in the house suddenly clicked back on. Terrified and realizing he could no longer handle this alone, Bill called his brother, Bob. He begged Bob to come over immediately, explaining that something highly unusual was happening in his home. When Bob arrived, Bill was pale and visibly shaking. Bill did not want to describe the supernatural details, fearing his brother's skepticism, so he decided to perform a test. He led Bob to the hallway closet, opened the door, and told Bob to step inside, turn off the closet light, and tell him what happened. Bob, deeply confused by his brother's bizarre behavior, reluctantly agreed. He stepped into the dark closet and closed the door, while inside Bob felt a sudden, distinct physical pressure brush against his leg. A moment later, something struck him sharply in the face, but Bob, being a highly pragmatic man himself, assumed he had simply bumped into a hanging coat hanger or a pair of shoes in the dark. He did not want to feed into Bill's obvious state of paranoia, so when he opened the door, he looked at his brother and told him that absolutely nothing had happened inside the closet. He advised Bill to get some rest and left the house. Bill felt incredibly isolated. He decided to call his close friend Michael, who was a professional sound engineer. Bill explained the strange events, and as they were talking, the deep, demonic voice suddenly interrupted their call again, chanting in tongues. Michael, operating on his professional instincts, immediately grabbed his recording equipment, held his microphone to the phone receiver, and recorded the terrifying audio for nearly 2 minutes. While the voice was chanting, Bill was on the other end, screaming at Michael to hang up the phone, sensing that the voice was highly malevolent. When the chanting stopped and the line cleared, Michael told Bill he had recorded the entire thing and played the audio back over the line. But when the recording played, there was absolute silence. The recording had captured Michael's questions and Bill's frantic screams to hang up, but the demonic chanting voice itself had left absolutely no imprint on the digital recording. It was as if the sound existed only in their physical ears, but could not be captured by scientific instruments. A few nights later, Bill invited Bob and his wife Cindy over for dinner, hoping that having family in the house would bring some peace. They were sitting in the living room watching television, with Bill sitting in his favorite chair. Suddenly, Bill stood up, pointing toward the dark dining room. He whispered that he had just seen the shadow again. He asked Bob to sit in his chair, which had the only direct line of sight into the dining room, and simply watch the television to see if anything caught his eye. Bob sat in the chair, and within a few minutes he gasped, jumping to his feet. He stated that he had just watched a small, distinct shadow, shaped like a small creature standing on 2 legs, dart rapidly across the dining room floor. Cindy then took a turn sitting in the chair, and she witnessed the exact same bizarre phenomenon. Terrified for Bill's safety, Bob and Cindy begged him to pack a bag and come stay at their house. But Bill, driven by a stubborn sense of pride and a refusal to be driven out of his own home, refused to leave. After his family left, Bill decided to abandon his scientific skepticism. He spent the night researching demonic activity and exorcisms. He discovered that in certain theological beliefs, a demon being cast out during an exorcism requires a new physical host. Bill realized with horror that the woman at the brick house had demanded he arrive at exactly 5 o'clock, the precise moment her ceremony reached its climax. He had been lured to the house to serve as an unwitting vessel for the entity she was casting out, and it had followed him home. Bill eventually contacted a specialized paranormal investigation team led by a man named Brian Hall. The team arrived with advanced thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and motion-activated lasers, which they set up throughout Bill's bedroom during the investigation. One of the team members sat on Bill's bed, calling out to any entities in the room. Suddenly, a heavy laser emitter perched on a solid table was violently thrown to the ground. When the team reviewed the camera footage, they saw a thick, glowing mist materialize in the center of the room, swirling around the laser beams right before the device was knocked over. They also captured strange, whispered voices on their audio equipment. The team packed up their gear and urged Bill to abandon the house immediately, warning him that the entity was highly aggressive. But Bill stayed that night. Bill lay in his bed with all the lights on and classical music playing softly on his radio. Suddenly, a massive, deafening explosion rocked the house, sounding as if a semi-truck had crashed into the front porch at 80 miles an hour. Bill ran outside, but the street was empty, and there was no damage to his home. The moment he stepped back inside, an identical deafening crash erupted in his dining room, shaking the floorboards, but nothing was damaged or out of place. His car alarm began screaming outside. Bill, pushed to his absolute limit, began screaming back at the empty house, challenging the entity to show itself. The deafening crashing sounds moved upstairs into his bedroom, echoing off the walls with violent, bone-rattling intensity, even though nothing in the room was moving. After several minutes of pure chaos, the sound abruptly stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Bill climbed back onto his bed, curling into the fetal position, terrified that he had made the entity even angrier. He heard a slow, heavy shuffling sound coming from the floor at the foot of his bed. As he watched, a massive, solid, 6-foot-tall silhouette of pure blackness emerged from the floorboards. The entity had no human features except for a wide, gaping mouth filled with sharp, jagged white teeth. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, gliding toward Bill until its face was just inches from his own. It let out a deep, wet, animalistic grunt and then vanished into thin air. Following that terrifying night, Bill began waking up with deep, painful scratches dug into his chest and arms. He was hospitalized multiple times, suffering from acute, stress-induced cardiac events that simulated heart attacks. Despite the physical and psychological toll, Bill refused to sell his home. He explained to his worried family that he could not, in good conscience, sell the house to an unsuspecting family, knowing the absolute terror that awaited them inside those walls. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.